Welcome back to the deep dive. I am really glad you are here with us today because, well, we are sending a very specific mood right off the bat.
We really are. It is definitely a unique vibe today.
Right. So I want you to close your eyes for a second. Well, unless you are driving, please do not close your eyes if you are behind the wheel.
Safety first, always.
Exactly. But if you are at home, just imagine it is a Monday night, specifically October 3rd, 1966. It is 9 p.m. The air is cooling down outside, maybe a little crisp, some leaves on the ground. But inside this modest apartment in Elmira, New York, the atmosphere is...
It is heavy.
Yeah, heavy.
It is a massive shift from the mundane to the profound. We are stepping back into the living room of Jane Roberts and her husband, Robert Butts. And for the uninitiated, this is not just a couple hanging out watching television. This is the absolute epicenter of the Seth Material.
Right. And for those of you who might be new to this particular rabbit hole, Jane is the medium who speaks for an energy personality essence named Seth. And Robert, who Seth affectionately calls Joseph, is the guy furiously scribbling notes in shorthand.
Shorthand that he later spent hours typing up, thankfully for us.
Yes, very thankfully. But tonight is not just a standard lecture from the great beyond. It is this wild mix of high-concept philosophy and, frankly, a parlor game that turns into a totally chilling proof of ability. We are going to be looking at session 290 of the early sessions, book 7 of the Seth Material.
And before we unlock the door to that apartment, we do need to explicitly state for the record that this deep dive is distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes only.
Absolutely. We are here to learn, to explore, and maybe get a little spooked. And the source material we are unpacking today comes directly from the archives published by the New Awareness Network. If you want to follow along with the source text, the date of record is, again, October 3, 1966.
I think it is really important to mention the overall mission of this specific dive, too, because usually Seth sessions are either very theoretical, covering massive universal concepts, or they are very personal to Jane and Robert.
Right, like health advice or life guidance.
Exactly. But session 290 is unique. It really feels like it is split into two very distinct halves that honestly should not work together, but somehow they just do.
It is like a double feature at the drive-in. On one side, we have this deep, mind-bending, theoretical exploration of dreams. Specifically, why we dream about animals, reptiles versus mammals, and what that actually says about human evolution. It challenges the entire scientific consensus of the 1960s in a pretty major way.
It completely upends it. And then on the other side, we move from that theory right into practice. We get to witness a real-time experiment in clairvoyance known as the envelope experiment. We basically watch Seth try to read the history of an object sealed inside a double envelope. And the kicker for this one...
The envelope is completely empty.
It is empty.
That is the part that gets me every time. It is like a magic trick, but with actual metaphysical stakes. So you have this spooky trance channel set up, which I think usually scares people off because they expect it to be dark or cult-like or overly solemn. But what I absolutely love about reading this transcript is just how human it is. There is humor, there is banter, there is even a pet cat involved.
It is incredibly grounded. You have Jane entering this deep trance state, her voice deepening and changing into Seth's, while Robert is just trying to keep his pen moving fast enough. It is domestic, yet completely otherworldly at the same time.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with part 1, which we can call the dreamscape, because this whole session kicks off with a newspaper clipping, right? Which was not planned at all.
It definitely was not planned, and this is crucial for understanding how Seth operates. Robert had found an article in the New York Times that very day. It was about a study conducted by a psychologist at the University of North Carolina regarding animals in dreams.
And the timeline here is so funny to me. Robert shows Jane this article about 10 minutes before they start the session. Literally just 10 minutes. She barely has time to skim the headlines.
Precisely. Jane reads it, Robert clips it out, and then boom, Jane goes into trance. And Seth does not waste a single second. He does not say hello. He does not do a warm-up exercise. He immediately launches into a critique of that specific newspaper article.
He is like that friend who walks into a room and just immediately continues an argument you were having in the car 3 hours ago. And another thing. So what was the article actually claiming that got Seth so fired up?
Well, the prevailing psychological theory of the time, and the article's main point, was that dream images of reptiles versus mammals were directly linked to emotional maturity. The idea was that if you are dreaming of snakes and lizards and cold-blooded creatures, you are perhaps regressing. You are showing immaturity or primitive urges.
Right.
But if you dream of mammals, you are more evolved. You are more emotionally mature.
That sounds very Freudian to me. Very much a ladder of progress kind of thinking. Like if I dream of a golden retriever, I'm a good functioning member of society. But if I dream of a snake, I am some primitive savage who needs therapy. And Seth was just not buying it.
Not for a single second. Seth completely dismantles this maturity myth. He argues that it has absolutely nothing to do with your emotional growth in this current lifetime. Instead, he introduces this absolutely fascinating concept of cellular consciousness.
Okay, hold on. Cellular consciousness. That sounds a bit like we were talking about DNA, right? But this is 1966. Watson and Crick discovering the double helix was only about a decade prior. Is Seth actually talking about genetics here?
It parallels genetics, but Seth goes much weirder and much deeper.
Yeah.
He is not just talking about physical traits like passing down blue eyes or curly hair. He is talking about a literal consciousness record. He describes it as a generic imprint stamped within the cells.
A generic imprint.
Right. Think of it like a hard drive that comes preloaded with the entire operating system of planetary evolution.
So my cells literally remember being a lizard. Because that sounds a little bit sci-fi.
In a way, yes. Seth argues that the cells possess a memory that is both chemical and electromagnetic. They actually remember the physical sensation of being cold-blooded. They remember the struggle of the reptile in the primordial muck. And usually, this stuff is buried deep in the sub-basement of our daily awareness.
Which is good, because if we were actively remembering being a lizard all day, we probably would not get much work done at the office.
Exactly. You could not function. But when we sleep...
The guard comes down.
Yes. When we sleep, the ego, which is essentially the manager upstairs running the daily show, goes off the clock. And suddenly that noise from the basement, that electromagnetic hum of our evolutionary past, drifts up. And our brain, trying to make sense of this raw chemical feeling, paints a picture. It paints a snake.
So the snake is not a symbol of evil or immaturity. It is literally a translation of a feeling.
Exactly. It is a user interface for raw biological data. To quote the session, Seth says, "The reptilian images do not represent maturity nor immaturity, but are simply designations natural to a particular level of cellular consciousness. It is just your biology checking in and running a diagnostic."
That paints a much cooler picture of dreaming. It is like time travel for your biology. But then Seth takes this entirely biological concept and applies it to the social dynamics of 1966, specifically regarding men and women. And I have to say, this part made me laugh out loud when I read it. It feels like a stand-up routine about gender norms.
It is quite humorous and, frankly, a bit biting. Seth explains that while this cellular memory is completely universal, our civilization forces us to filter these dreams differently based on our gender.
Right. He says women tend to repress the reptile dreams entirely. And why? Because they are taught from birth to fear them. Unless it is a nightmare, a woman in the 1960s is not supposed to be happily hanging out with snakes in her sleep. It's not considered ladylike.
But they do remember mammal dreams. Seth points out that mammals are warm-blooded and have reproductive systems similar to humans. It is safer, more familiar territory for the female psyche of that era. But the analysis of men is where Seth gets really sharp.
Oh, this is the absolute best part. He says men repress the mammal dreams. And the reason? Because they do not want to be reminded of the female's reproductive advantages.
It is a fascinating dig at the male ego. Seth implies that even in the depths of sleep, the male ego is so fragile that seeing a mammal, which is inherently defined by its biological ability to give birth, to nurse, to nurture, actually threatens the male's sense of dominance or separation from nature. So the man just blocks it out entirely.
So men block out mammal dreams because they are subconsciously jealous of breastfeeding.
Essentially, yes. Or rather, they are jealous of the inherent power of life creation that mammals represent, which is biologically female-centric. It profoundly challenges the lone hunter narrative that men are socialized to uphold.
That is hilarious. So you have men terrified of biology and women terrified of snakes, all because of arbitrary social conditioning. It really highlights how much our waking life messes with our sleeping life.
It really does. And it brings us directly back to the core conflict between cellular consciousness and the ego. This is a massive central theme in the Seth Material. Cellular consciousness is ancient. It straddles sleep and waking. It existed long before the ego was ever formed, and it will persist even after the ego changes or dissolves.
So the ego is just the new kid on the block. The middle manager who thinks he runs the entire factory, but the cells are the actual floor workers who know how the machines operate.
That is a perfect analogy. Seth mentions that cellular consciousness is emotional rather than visual. It deals in deep, codified data. When we have a visual dream, like seeing a lizard or seeing a bear, that is just a surface-level translation.
A translation.
Yes. The visual image is the conscious brain trying its best to make sense of a deep inner comprehension. Seth states, the visual dream images are but translations of inner comprehensions. The cells feel the history, and the brain frantically paints a picture of a dinosaur to explain why it feels that way.
That makes dreams feel so much less random. It is not just, oh, I ate spicy pizza last night, so I dreamed of a dragon. It is my cells are literally remembering what it was like to be cold-blooded and adjusting to temperature changes. But Seth does not stop at the past, does he? This is where it gets really interesting. He drops an absolute bombshell about the nature of time itself.
He does, and this begins part 2 of our discussion, the philosophy of time. And you were right, this changes everything about the framework. Seth introduces the concept of the spacious present.
The spacious present. I mean, it sounds poetic, I will give him that, but practically speaking, it sounds a bit like nonsense. If my cells know the future, why did I stub my toe on the coffee table this morning? Why didn't my big toe warn me?
That is the million-dollar question. And Seth actually addresses that exact disconnect. He distinguishes strictly between the cellular self and the ego self. Your toe might very well have known the coffee table was there in the probable future, but you, meaning the ego, were not listening to the broadcast.
Okay, but that feels like a bit of a cop-out. Oh, the magic only happens when you are not looking. How does Seth explain the actual mechanics of this? Is he saying the future has already happened? Because that implies a deterministic universe where we have no free will.
Not quite, and this is where it gets highly technical. Seth does not say the future is fixed or predestined. He says the cells hold blueprints of probabilities.
Blueprints of probabilities. Break that down for me.
Imagine an architect's drafting desk. The blueprints for a massive building are sitting right there. The building does not exist yet physically, but the structure, the potential, is completely defined in the data on the page. Seth argues that our cells literally hold the blueprints for next week. The events exist as electromagnetic potential before they ever materialize into physical reality.
Okay, so the data's there. My cells are actively reading the blueprints for what happens next Tuesday. Why don't I know about it? Why is my conscious, waking mind completely clueless?
Because of the ego. The ego acts as a massive sensor. Its primary job is to organize perception so we can function in linear physical reality. If we were constantly bombarded with emotional and visual data from next Tuesday, we could not focus on simply walking down the stairs today. So the ego aggressively cuts that data out.
It is like an aggressive spam filter for time.
Exactly. Seth explains precisely why we forget dreams of the future. He says, the ego does not perceive their significance, lack of recognition, identification, acceptance.
So if I dream about something that happened yesterday, my ego wakes up and says, ah, yes, I remember that, file it under memory. But if I dream about a totally new place I am going to visit next week.
The ego looks at it and says, this is complete gibberish. It does not fit my linear narrative of the past. Delete. It appears totally meaningless to the ego because it has not been validated yet in the physical waking world.
That explains so much about the feeling of déjà vu. You know that weird feeling? You walk into a room you have never been in and you just stop and think, I have absolutely been here before. Maybe you actually have. Maybe you dreamt it last month, your ego deleted it from your waking memory, but when you physically walk in, the ego finally matches the data and goes, oh, now I recognize this.
That is exactly the mechanism Seth is describing. He explicitly says, yesterday's events reenacted in a dream touch off familiarity, tomorrow's events in tonight's dreams do not. We are constantly dreaming the future. We just are not allowed to remember it until it safely becomes the present.
That is just chilling. It basically means we are all minor prophets walking around with terrible memories.
In a way, yes, we all have the capacity, and Seth links this directly to what he calls traveling through intensities.
Intensities. What does he mean by that term?
Seth struggles a bit with words here because our entire language is based on linear time, past, present, future. But he suggests that traveling through time is actually just shifting your intensity, shifting your focus of consciousness. And he points out that children are much better at this than adults.
Why children? Just because their brains are still developing?
Because they have not built up the ego's defensive walls yet. They are much closer to that raw cellular consciousness. That is why kids have such incredibly vivid animal dreams and often have much better spontaneous psychic recall. They have not been taught to rigorously censor the future or the deep past yet.
So we basically spend our childhoods open to everything, taking in all these timelines, and then we spend our adulthoods building massive concrete walls to shut it all out, just so he can hold down a 9-to-5 job and pay taxes.
It seems to be the necessary trade-off for having a highly focused physical existence in this particular reality system.
It is a deeply fascinating theory. This idea that we're all swimming in a massive soup of past, present, and future, and only our rigid ego keeps us locked in the illusion of now. But honestly, without proof, it is just really cool sci-fi. It's a nice bedtime story.
And that is exactly why this specific session, session 290, is so historically important, because usually Seth just lectures. He acts as the professor giving us the theory. But halfway through this Monday night, the mood completely shifts. The lecture hall closes and the laboratory opens.
So they decide to put the theory to the test.
Right there in the Almayer living room. If the spacious present is real, if information from the past and future is actually accessible to the inner self, then Seth should be able to perceive things that the physical eyes of Jane Roberts cannot possibly see.
Into the envelope. Which brings us to part 3 of our deep dive, the envelope experiment.
Yes. Robert reaches over and hands Jane, who is still sitting there in a deep trance, speaking as Seth, a double-sealed envelope.
Double-sealed. So there's absolutely no way to see through it, even when he opened her eyes.
Correct. Robert literally places it between 2 thick pieces of cardboard and then seals that inside another opaque envelope. But here is the massive twist for this specific session. The envelope inside is empty.
Empty. Just blank paper.
Technically, yes. It is a completely blank white envelope that had been sent to Robert by an old friend named Wendell Crowley. The letter that originally came inside it had been taken out months ago. So Seth is sitting there holding a blank white envelope against Jane's forehead.
Talk about an impossible challenge. Just here, tell me the rich history of this absolute nothingness.
And exactly. And Robert actually notes the humor in the situation in his private notes. But Seth does not hesitate for a second. He starts giving rapid-fire impressions immediately. And remember the theory here. He is not reading the paper itself. He's reading the energy or the imprint connected to the object in the spacious present.
So let's go through the hits, because when you actually read the transcript, it is not just a dry list of facts. It reads like a detective puzzle being solved in real time. What is the very first thing Seth gets?
So Jane is there, eyes closed, pressing this empty envelope to her forehead. And the first thing Seth says is weirdly specific. He says, "I sense a double," or a negative.
A negative, like someone having a bad attitude. Or a math equation.
That is exactly what you would think. Robert records this in shorthand and probably thinks to himself, okay, swing and a miss right out of the gate. But later, when they actually track down the missing letter that should have been inside, who was it from?
Wendell Crowley.
And what did Wendell and Robert do for a living together back in the 1940s?
They were artists.
Specifically, they worked in a commercial art studio. They worked constantly with photography and layouts. Negative was not an emotion or a math term. It was a noun, a film negative.
Oh, wow. I see. So Seth is literally picking up on the professional jargon of their shared friendship.
Exactly. And the double part of the clue. The letter Wendell wrote repeatedly used the number 2. It mentioned a 20th anniversary, a 2-mile walk, lifting 20 pounds. The conceptual imprint of two-ness was stamped all over the energy of that letter.
Okay, that is a really solid hit. What about the vertical impression? Seth says at one point he senses something standing vertical. That sounds a bit like a cheap horoscope reading. You know, I sense something tall in your life.
It does sound incredibly vague at first glance, but look at the source again. Wendell Crowley, the sender of the envelope, was actually a partner in a lumber company at the time. Trees, wood, something standing vertical.
It is like playing a really intense game of charades with a ghost.
It is remarkably similar to how military remote viewing is described today. You get basic shapes, textures, and spatial relationships long before you get proper names or nouns. Seth is sensing the core essence of Wendell's daily life, which is lumber, attached to the envelope's energy.
Okay, now let's talk about the travel stuff, because this blew my mind. Seth starts describing a circular corridor, a train tunnel, and a string of lights.
This is where the concept of the spacious present really proves itself. The letter that came in that envelope described a reunion of old artists taking place in New York City. To get to that reunion from his home in New Jersey, Wendell likely had to drive directly through the Lincoln Tunnel.
The Lincoln Tunnel, which has curved tile walls and endless strings of lights overhead.
Exactly. Seth was sensing the physical journey Wendell took to get to the reunion that was mentioned in the missing letter. He describes the actual physical sensation of a tunnel, of moving quickly through a curved, artificially lit corridor.
So he is literally tracking the writer of the letter through space and time just from holding the empty paper it came in.
Hmm?
But there is one hit in this session that I think is the undeniable aha moment. It is the small round object.
Ah, yes. This is the detail that completely shatters the skeptical argument. Seth says, a bottom or middle drawer and a small round object.
Now, the envelope is entirely flat. There's absolutely nothing round inside it.
No, nothing inside. But Robert realizes something incredible. For months, that empty envelope in the original letter had been sitting on his messy desk. And what had he used as a makeshift paperweight to hold them down?
A tape dispenser.
A plastic tape dispenser. A small, round object with a circular hole right in the center. Seth was not just reading the history of the envelope from New Jersey. He was reading the physical environment where the envelope had been sitting for months, right there in Robert's room.
That gave me genuine chills when I read it, because it implies that objects are not just isolated dead things. They actively absorb their surroundings. The envelope literally remembered the tape dispenser sitting on top of it.
Or, if we go back to the theory from earlier, the cellular consciousness, or the energy imprint, encompasses the entire scene as one unified event. The envelope, the wooden desk, the plastic tape dispenser, they're all part of the exact same intensity or event cluster in the spacious present.
It completely validates the whole theory from part 1.
Completely. And that brings us perfectly to the synthesis of the episode.
Right, part 4. How do we connect all these disparate dots? We have the grand theory that cells know the past and future, and then we have Seth proving he can pull incredibly specific data from a blank envelope that connects 1943, when they were in the art studio, to 1966 with the tape dispenser, and the physical travel Wendell took in between.
It practically demonstrates the total fluidity of time. Seth smoothly navigated what he calls intensities. He pulled emotional information from the 1940s, the deep nostalgia of the art studio days. He pulled physical information from the present, Robert's desk in Elmira. And he pulled location data from the sender in New Jersey.
And to Seth, those are not 3 completely different times and places separated by decades and miles.
No. To Seth, and to the inner ego of all of us, they're all just one connected web of emotional significance. The empty envelope was just the focal point, the geometric coordinate that allowed him to access that specific web of data.
It is really interesting that you mentioned significance, because the connection between Robert and Wendell was not just casual like a bill from the utility company. They were old, close friends. There was a lot of genuine emotion there.
That is the absolute key to all of this. Seth often says that emotions are the literal carrier waves for this kind of psychic information. The deep nostalgia for the old comic strip days, the warm old boys club feeling of the reunion, that emotional charge is what made the signal so incredibly strong. It is exactly why Seth picked up on the ink and the studio vibes so clearly. I mean, he even picked up a pun.
The pun. I almost forgot about the spelling thing.
It is brilliant. Seth spells out the letters INC, like incorporated, for a business. Then he stops, corrects himself, and says, no, it is a distortion of pen and ink. He sensed the concept of ink, but his brain's first translation was the business abbreviation ink.
That is wild. He is picking up a homophone pun on ink versus ink from a completely blank envelope. It is so remarkably human.
And speaking of the human element, we absolutely have to mention the cat.
Oh yes, we cannot forget the cat. This is genuinely my favorite part of the entire transcript because it is just so absurd. Right in the middle of this profound, gravity-defying, psychic reading, the transcript dryly notes that a cat jumps onto Jane's lap.
It is the best moment of the entire night. We are deep in the weeds of clairvoyance. Seth is masterfully navigating the spacious present, connecting minds across New Jersey and New York, proving the fluidity of time, and then thud.
The cat.
The pet cat just launches itself right onto Jane's lap.
Now, if I'm channeling an ancient, highly evolved energy personality, I feel like a sudden cat with claws would break the connection. I would wake up startled. I would be like, hey, claws, watch it.
You would think it would shatter the trance entirely, but Jane does not wake up, and Seth does not leave. But the transcript notes this hilarious shift in the room's energy. Robert, the husband, is suddenly frantic. He is trying to quickly shoo the cat away so it does not scratch Jane while she is defenseless. And Seth just pauses.
Does he actually acknowledge the cat verbally?
He does, but he does not get angry or act deeply offended. It is this perfect, beautiful collision of the high-concept cosmic and the low-maintenance domestic. You have this ancient entity discussing the architecture of time itself, and he literally has to pause the lecture because a house cat wants a scratch behind the ears.
It actually makes the whole thing significantly more believable to me.
Why is that?
Because if it were fake, if it were a calculated performance, the medium would probably make a massive deal out of the interruption. They would say, do not disturb the spirits, the connection is broken. But the fact that they just casually deal with the cat and keep right on going, it feels like real messy life. It grounds the whole spooky thing.
It completely demystifies the process. It is not happening in some darkened temple or a sterile scientific lab. It is happening right amidst the chaos of daily domestic life.
So if we pull back and look at the bigger picture here, Seth validates the cellular consciousness theory by successfully doing the envelope experiment. He shows that information, whether it is about reptiles in our evolutionary past or a plastic tape dispenser on a messy desk, is always available if you just know how to tune the dial.
Precisely. The envelope experiment is the practical, physical application of the inner dreamscape theory. In our dreams, we accidentally tune into these other frequencies. In the experiment, Seth deliberately tunes into them to prove a point. He shows us that the barriers the ego puts up, the rigid barriers of linear time and physical space, are entirely permeable.
It really makes you look at your own dreams completely differently.
It certainly should. It changes the entire paradigm of sleep.
Which perfectly leads us to our final thought for you today. If Seth is right, if our cells actually hold blueprints of the probable future that our ego constantly filters out, what does that mean for you tonight?
It raises a deeply provocative question. What are you going to dream about tonight that will actually happen next week? Are you seeing the future every single night, but your waking mind just throws it in the trash bin because it does not make logical sense yet?
It is a haunting thought, honestly. Maybe we are all prophets. We just have really, really strict editors living in our heads.
And perhaps by simply understanding this, by realizing that the spacious present exists all around us, we can start to tell the ego to relax just a little bit. Maybe we can learn to catch those fleeting glimpses of tomorrow before they are aggressively censored.
If you want to try and catch those glimpses, or if you just want to dive much deeper into this incredible material, there's so much more to explore. We've really only scratched the surface of session 290.
Absolutely. I highly encourage you to study the Seth Material books directly. There are volumes upon volumes of this stuff, and each one is an absolute goldmine of insight.
You can find them and directly support the publisher by visiting the New Awareness at Work website and bookstore. You can find that at setcenter.com/the early-sessions.
The source text offers so much more nuance on exactly how consciousness interacts with physical matter. And frankly, just reading the raw transcripts is an experience in itself. You get to see the typos, the pauses, the cat interruptions.
It really is an experience.
Yeah.
There's a distinct rhythm to Seth's speech, a real personality that comes through right on the page. So go check it out. And hey, next time you dream about a lizard, please do not worry about your emotional maturity.
No, definitely not. Just remember, it is your cells saying a quick hello to a very old version of themselves.
Exactly. Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you in the spacious present.